All right, so you've sent me some really interesting stuff about Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
A lot of it's about this whole idea that the U.S. government knew about the attack beforehand,
Uh,
and not just like we kind of saw it coming thing,
right.
but like maybe even let it happen.
Yeah, some folks even say they encouraged it.
It sounds like something out of a movie, right?
Absolutely.
So let's dive into all this and try to make sense of it.
Oh, okay.
Figure out if there's any real evidence or if it's just a really good story.
That's what we're here for.
So where do we even start with a theory like this?
Well, it's interesting how fast this whole debate started up.
Yeah.
Like right after the attack, people were already questioning what Roosevelt knew.
Makes sense, I guess, in hindsight.
There was this guy, John T. Flynn, investigating Pearl Harbor for Congress, and he was one of the first to say Roosevelt was trying to get the U.S. into the war by provoking Japan.
And that idea just kind of stuck around.
Yep. And over the years, lots of writers have picked it up and run with it.
Okay, so let's break down this conspiracy theory. The main idea, I guess, is that top U.S. officials, maybe even Roosevelt himself, knew the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
And why? What would be the point of letting something like that happen?
Well, the theory goes that Roosevelt needed a way to get the American public behind going to war in Europe.
Because at that point, we weren't really involved, right?
Exactly. We were officially neutral.
So the attack would be like a backdoor into the war.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just an American thing either, right? Some versions of the theory even bring the UK into it.
Yeah, that's right. But some people say Churchill was in on it too.
Wow, so a massive transatlantic conspiracy.
But before we get too deep into that, we should probably mention that most historians don't really buy it.
They don't.
No. They see it as a fringe theory.
I see.
They say there are lots of problems with the evidence and the sources people use to support it.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
It's important to keep that in mind. But still, the U.S. government didn't just ignore what happened at Pearl Harbor, did they? They launched a bunch of investigations, right?
Oh, yeah. Tons of them.
Like, how many are we talking about?
The material you sent mentioned 10 separate inquiries between 1941 and 1995.
10. That's a lot.
Makes you wonder if there was a cover-up. Why even bother with so many investigations, right?
That's a good point.
But over and over, those inquiries pointed to things like incompetence, underestimating Japan, and intelligence failures as the main reasons for the disaster.
So, like, missing the warning signs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was so much secrecy around code breaking back then.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Plus, the Army and Navy weren't exactly sharing information like they should have.
And I guess all this was happening before computers and stuff, so it must have been incredibly difficult to process all the information coming in.
Absolutely. They were basically drowning in data,
Yeah.
but didn't have the people or the systems to analyze it effectively.
You mentioned code breaking and how secretive it was.
Yeah.
I remember reading that the early investigators didn't even have the right security clearance to see all the decrypted messages.
That's right. They were basically locked out of the most sensitive information.
And wasn't there this guy, a general, who was the gatekeeper of all those messages?
Yeah, Brigadier General Henry D. Russell. He was the one who held the keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
What about Henry Clausen? Didn't he run into some roadblocks too?
Oh yeah, he's the guy who wrote Pearl Harbor Final Judgment.
Right, I read that book.
So even though Secretary of War Stimson tried to give Clausen access to everything, he claimed he was still being stonewalled by people.
Wow, really?
He said he had to prove he already had access to top secret stuff before they'd fully cooperate.
Talk about a catch-22.
Yeah, it's almost like they were trying to protect something.
You know, make sure he didn't stumble onto anything too sensitive.
Right. And even after Clausen finished his investigation and sent a report to Congress, it was heavily censored because of secrecy concerns.
Mostly around code breaking, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't until the early 90s that a more complete version of his book came out.
But even that wasn't without its critics, right?
Oh no, not at all.
Mm.
Some historians pointed out that Clausen didn't even interview General Walter Short.
The Army commander at Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
Why not?
Who knows? Maybe Clausen thought he already had enough information.
Or maybe Short refused to talk.
It's possible. But without hearing Short's side of the story, it's hard to say if Clausen's findings were totally reliable.
It just goes to show how complicated all this is.
Yeah, even decades later, we're still piecing together what really happened.
So to get back to the idea of the U.S. provoking Japan, this hints on the idea that the U.S. didn't know Japan would attack right.
Right.
If they knew the specifics, then it's not really provocation. It's more like setting a trap.
Exactly.
So let's look at what the U.S. knew and didn't know through their intelligence efforts
Okay.
and what was going on diplomatically between the two countries.
Sounds good.
Because the argument is that Roosevelt was actively trying to get Japan to make the first move.
Yeah, to provoke them into an act of war.
And there are some pretty interesting quotes from people who were there that kind of support this idea. Like Rear Admiral Frank Edmund Beatty Jr. He was close to Roosevelt, and he said it was clear that the U.S. was pushing Japan into a corner. And that both Roosevelt and Churchill wanted the U.S. to join the war.
Interesting.
He even said the conditions the U.S. put on Japan, like demanding they withdraw from China, were so harsh that some kind of reaction was inevitable.
I see.
Then there's Jonathan Daniels, another one of Roosevelt's aides. He said something pretty chilling about FDR's reaction to the attack.
What was that?
He said the blow was heavier than he had hoped, but that the risks paid off, even the loss was worth the price.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Yeah, it is. It definitely makes you wonder what Roosevelt was really thinking.
But we have to remember that these are just snippets from individual perspectives.
Yeah.
We don't know the full context of those conversations or what other information those people had access to.
True.
Like, Beatty was an aide to the Secretary of the Navy, so he was definitely in the loop. But was he privy to the highest level strategic thinking? Did he know what Roosevelt was really planning?
Good point. We can't just take these quotes at face value.
Exactly. We have to consider the source and their potential biases.
And speaking of provocative quotes, there's that infamous entry from Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson's diary.
Oh, yeah, the one from just 10 days before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, he talks about meeting with Roosevelt to discuss how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves.
That's a quote the conspiracy theorists love to bring up.
Yeah, it's hard to read that and not think something was going on.
It really highlights the fine line between diplomacy and provocation.
But here's the thing. Stimson himself later expressed surprise at how unprepared Pearl Harbor was.
Yeah, that doesn't really fit with the idea that they were deliberately baiting Japan into attacking.
Right. You'd think if they knew it was coming, they'd be more ready for it.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe they were playing a dangerous game but didn't really expect it to go this far.
So it's possible they were trying to provoke Japan but didn't anticipate such a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor.
That's one way to interpret it.
Okay, let's talk about the McCollum memo.
Ah, yes, the infamous memo.
This was written by a lieutenant commander in naval intelligence back in 1940.
Right.
And it basically laid out 8 actions that could potentially provoke Japan into attacking the U.S.
It even included the line, "If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better."
That sounds pretty damning right, like a smoking gun for the conspiracy.
It definitely raises questions about the U.S.'s intentions.
But was this memo actually influential?
That's the key question. Some theorists claim it was central to U.S. policy.
And that all 8 of its recommendations were put into action?
Exactly. But there's no direct evidence that Roosevelt ever saw the memo.
Really?
So it's hard to say how much it actually influenced his decisions.
Plus, there were other officials like Stark and Marshall who were explicitly warning against war with Japan.
Right, and Gouraud stressed how important it was to avoid war with Japan so we could focus on supporting the fight in Europe.
So it sounds like there was a real debate within the government about how to handle Japan.
Absolutely, it wasn't a monolithic view.
And even if some people, like McCollum, were pushing for provocation, it doesn't mean that was the official policy.
Exactly.
Okay, what about Oliver Littleton, the British Minister of War Production?
Yeah, what about him?
He flat out said Japan was provoked into attacking.
He did.
And he pointed to things like Lend-Lease and the Neutrality Patrol as evidence that the U.S. was already supporting the Allies even before officially entering the war.
It's true that the U.S. was helping the Allies in various ways.
But was that enough to provoke Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor?
That's debatable.
And again, we have to be careful about taking these statements out of context.
Right, what was Littleton's perspective? What information did he have access to?
Was he really in a position to know what the U.S. was thinking and planning?
Good questions. And we have to consider the potential for bias.
Like maybe he was trying to justify Britain's own actions or downplay any role they might have played.
Exactly. We can't just accept these claims without critical analysis.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what the U.S. actually knew about Japanese plans through their intelligence efforts.
Sounds good.
Specifically code breaking, because this is where things get really technical.
It is a bit of a rabbit hole.
But it's crucial to understanding what the U.S. might have known before the attack.
Absolutely.
So, from what I've read, American signals intelligence in 1941 was pretty advanced,
It was.
but also kind of uneven.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Apparently, they had this huge code-breaking operation going on, but it got shut down in 1929.
Yep. for ethical considerations of all things.
Really? So they had to start from scratch.
Pretty much.
That must set them back quite a bit.
It did, but they still managed to break some lower-level Japanese codes by late 1941.
And they were even reading the highest security diplomatic code used by the Japanese Foreign Office.
Yeah, that was the Purple Code.
But they hadn't cracked the main Japanese Navy code JN-25.
Not fully.
And on top of that, they didn't have enough people to handle all the intercepted messages.
They were short on translators and cryptanalysts.
So basically, they were drowning in information but couldn't process it fast enough.
That's right.
So the U.S. could read some Japanese messages, but not necessarily the ones that would have given them a clear warning about Pearl Harbor.
Exactly.
The Purple Code break is interesting, though.
It is.
I read that a 14-part message was decoded right before the attack.
Yeah, that was a big one.
And it basically signaled that Japan was about to break off diplomatic relations.
It was a declaration of war in all but name.
Roosevelt supposedly said, "This means war," when he saw the first 13 parts.
He did, and Marshall sent out a warning to all Pacific bases.
But it was delayed.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So close yet so far.
It's tragic, really.
But even that 14-part message didn't mention Pearl Harbor specifically, right?
No, it didn't.
So while it signaled that something big was about to happen,
Yeah.
it didn't give away Japan's actual target.
Right.
And I've heard some conspiracy theorists say that there was purple traffic that pointed to Pearl Harbor, but that it was deliberately suppressed.
That's a common claim.
But is there any evidence to support that?
Not really. The Japanese military was notoriously secretive.
Yeah.
They didn't even share their plans with the Foreign Office sometimes.
So it's unlikely that they would have revealed such a sensitive operation through diplomatic channels.
Exactly.
What about JN-25, the main Japanese Navy code?
Now we're getting to the heart of the matter.
Because the material you sent says that there were no JN-25 decrypts with any real intelligence value before the attack.
That's right.
Which, if true, would completely contradict the idea that the U.S. knew what was coming.
It would.
So what's the story there?
Well, breaking a code like JN-25 was no easy feat.
It wasn't just a simple substitution cipher, was it?
No, it was a super encrypted code with multiple layers of encryption.
Making it incredibly difficult to crack, especially since they didn't have a lot of intercepted messages to work with.
Right before December 7th, the Japanese Navy wasn't very active in the war against China.
So there wasn't much radio traffic for the codebreakers to analyze.
Exactly. They didn't have what cryptographers call cryptanalytic depth.
So even though they were making some progress,
Yeah.
it wasn't enough to actually read the messages.
They were mostly focused on breaking the additive tables.
Which was only one step in the process.
Right. There was still a lot more work to be done.
So when someone like Lieutenant Leitweiler from Station Castai in the Philippines said his team could walk right across the number columns, that didn't mean they could understand the messages.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It just meant they were making progress on one specific aspect of the code.
The additives,
Yep.
but not the actual content of the messages.
Right.
And the Hewitt inquiry specifically looked into this and concluded that JN-25B didn't give them any clues about a Pearl Harbor attack.
Not before or after the fact.
Plus, they had so many intercepted messages to deal with that they couldn't analyze them all.
It was an overwhelming task.
So they had to prioritize.
Yeah.
And at that time, they were mostly focused on Japanese operations in Southeast Asia.
That's where they thought the main threat was.
So messages that didn't seem related to that were put on the back burner.
Exactly.
Which is understandable in a way, but also kind of tragic in hindsight.
It is.
Okay, so code breaking wasn't giving them a clear picture.
Right.
What about Japanese intelligence operations themselves? Did they have spies on the ground in Hawaii?
They did, but they weren't exactly master spies.
More like amateur hour.
Pretty much. There were some Abwehr agents.
German military intelligence.
Yep. But one of them was considered incompetent, and the other was a double agent who the FBI didn't take seriously.
So not exactly a wealth of talent.
No.
What about Takeo Yoshikawa?
Now he was the main Japanese spy in Hawaii.
Was he any good?
He was an IJN undercover officer.
Okay.
And he did send back some reports.
Yeah.
But none of them explicitly mentioned an attack on Pearl Harbor.
Really?
It was mostly routine intelligence gathering, reporting on ship movements and stuff like that.
So nothing that would have raised any major red flags?
Not really.
And then there's that whole thing about the Deadly Double board game ads.
Oh yeah, those were weird.
They appeared right before the attack, and some people thought they contained coded messages.
Yeah, with headlines like, Achtung warning alert, and strange dice numbers.
It definitely sounds suspicious.
It does, but it turns out it was just a real board game.
Really?
Yep, they actually sold it in stores.
Well, that's a bit of a letdown.
It is one of those things that seems really spooky in hindsight, but probably wasn't anything sinister at the time.
Okay, what about claims that the SS Lurline, a ship heading to Hawaii, picked up unusual Japanese radio traffic?
That's another one that gets brought up a lot.
It sounds like a missed opportunity, right? If they had detected the Japanese fleet, they could have warned Pearl Harbor.
Possibly. But there are some problems with that theory.
Like what?
Well, the Japanese were extremely careful about maintaining radio silence.
I've heard they even took fuses out of their circuits to prevent accidental transmissions.
Yeah, they were that serious about it.
And they left their radio operators behind in Japan.
To create the illusion that the fleet was still in home waters.
So even if the Lurline did pick up some signals, it's unlikely they came from the actual attack force.
Right. They were probably just hearing random Japanese commercial traffic.
Plus, the Lurline's original logs have disappeared.
And there are conflicting accounts about what they actually heard.
So it's hard to say for sure what they detected or if it was even significant.
Exactly.
What about other alleged detections? There's that Kamikaze 14 report where they heard a tactical circuit calling Maroos.
That one's a bit more technical.
Yeah.
But basically, the analysts at the time thought Maru referred to commercial ships or non-combat units.
So they didn't think it was anything to worry about.
Right. They figured it was just administrative stuff.
But wasn't the Akagi one of the carriers involved in the attack communicating with these Maroos?
It was, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything suspicious.
I see.
The Japanese were very good at deception.
They were masters of it.
And they could have easily used those communications to create a false impression.
Make it seem like they were just doing routine stuff.
Exactly.
So the bottom line is that there's no solid evidence of any radio intercepts that would have given a clear warning about Pearl Harbor.
That's right.
The Japanese were just too good at covering their tracks.
They were meticulous.
Now, there was one confirmed contact with the Japanese before the attack.
Yeah, the midget submarine.
The Ward sank it outside Pearl Harbor about an hour before the air raid.
Right.
So could that have been a warning?
It could have, but unfortunately, the report was delayed.
And by the time they decoded the message, it was too late.
Yeah, the attack had already begun.
So another missed opportunity.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
What about intelligence from other allied nations? Did the U.S. miss any warnings from them?
Well, they were all picking up signs that Japan was planning something.
But they were mostly focused on Southeast Asia.
Right. Everyone thought that was the most likely target.
Which makes sense given Japan's previous actions.
Exactly. They had already invaded Manchuria and were fighting in China.
So it was natural to assume they would continue expanding in that direction.
Yeah.
And even when they decoded the final part of the 14-part message, they were trying to link it to a Japanese convoy heading towards Thailand.
They were desperately trying to make sense of all the pieces.
But they were looking in the wrong place.
It happens.
Plus, the U.S. Navy had this idea that the Japanese would fight a decisive battle near Japan.
That was their traditional war plan.
But Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan was a complete departure from that.
Yeah, it was a bold and risky move.
And it completely caught the Americans off guard.
It did.
I also read about some more specific claims of advance warning.
Yeah, like what?
A report from the Peruvian ambassador, based on information from his cook, reports from a Korean labor organization.
Interesting.
And that warning from Dushako Popov to the FBI about German and Japanese interest in Pearl Harbor's defenses.
Yeah. What about those?
Well, the Peruvian ambassador's story was considered pretty unreliable.
Understandably.
I mean, it came from his cook.
Not exactly the most credible source.
The Korean reports might have been more accurate,
Maybe.
but they were probably still seen as less reliable than official intelligence assessments.
Makes sense.
And Popov's warning is fascinating.
It is.
He told the FBI that the Germans were asking him for detailed information about Pearl Harbor.
Which implied that the Japanese were interested too.
Yeah, but the FBI didn't really do anything with it.
They didn't.
No, they basically dismissed him.
Wow.
Maybe they thought he was making it up.
Or maybe they just didn't want to believe it.
It's hard to say.
It is.
And then there are the claims that Churchill knew about the attack and deliberately withheld the information from the U.S.
Ah, yes, that's a big one.
Some people say he knew as early as mid-November.
And that he even intercepted a signal, pinpointing December 7th as the date.
But is there any proof of that?
Well, there are lots of anecdotes and stories, but when you dig into them, they often fall apart.
Like that supposed meeting of the Joint Intelligence Committee where they discussed Pearl Harbor on December 5th.
Yeah, that one's been debunked.
Turns out it never happened.
Yep.
So as far as we know, there's no credible evidence that Churchill had specific knowledge of the attack and chose to keep it from the Americans.
It's a theory that's been circulating for years.
But it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about missed signals and intelligence failures.
Uh-huh.
But what about the official war warnings that the U.S. sent to Pearl Harbor in late November 1941?
Those were real, and they were specific.
In what way?
They explicitly stated that war with Japan was imminent,
Okay.
and that they expected an aggressive move within days.
So they knew something was coming.
They did.
But did they say anything about Pearl Harbor?
No. That's the key point.
They didn't.
The warnings focused on the Far East.
So they were looking in the wrong direction again.
It seems that way.
And they didn't give the commanders in Hawaii the raw intelligence behind those warnings,
Just the conclusions.
which has been criticized as a major failure.
Yeah, some people argue that Kimmel and Short should have been given more information.
So they could make their own assessments.
Exactly.
So how did Kimmel and Short react to these warnings?
The Short increased the alert level,
But he was mostly worried about sabotage?
which ironically led to the planes being parked close together, making them easier targets for an air raid.
And the radar wasn't being used effectively either?
It wasn't fully integrated, and they didn't have enough trained operators.
And the anti-aircraft guns weren't ready.
They weren't.
It sounds like they were caught completely flat-footed.
They were.
So a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and maybe some overconfidence.
It was a perfect storm of failures.
Now, Clausen's inquiries suggested that the vague warnings were partly to protect the fact that the U.S. was reading purple,
Uh-huh.
and because Kimmel and Short didn't have the clearance to know about that.
That's what he argued.
But even if that's true, it doesn't explain everything.
It doesn't.
Because General MacArthur in the Philippines had full access to purple and JN-25 decrypts.
Via station cast.
But he was still caught unprepared hours after Pearl Harbor.
That's right.
So even with the best intelligence in the world,
Yeah.
it's still possible to miss the warning signs.
It is Roberta Wohlstetter called this the noise in intelligence.
Where crucial signals get lost among a flood of other information.
Exactly.
And sometimes the noise can be so loud that you can't hear the signal at all.
That's what happened here.
One final thing that conspiracy theorists often point to is the fact that none of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor during the attack.
Ah, yes. The missing carriers.
They say it was deliberate to protect the most valuable ships.
But is there any evidence to support that?
Well, the official explanation is that the carriers were out on missions.
The Enterprise and Lexington were delivering fighters to Wake and Midway.
And the Saratoga was in refit.
Yeah.
Plus, the Enterprise's return was delayed by bad weather.
So it was all just a coincidence.
That's what they say.
But wouldn't it make more sense to protect your most important ships?
You would think so.
Especially if you knew an attack was coming.
Right, but in 1941, carriers weren't seen as the most important ships.
They weren't.
No, back then, battleships were considered the capital ships.
And carriers were just scouting vessels.
Pretty much.
Wow, how times have changed.
Yeah, it was Pearl Harbor itself that really demonstrated the power of carriers.
And shifted naval doctrine forever.
So if the U.S. was trying to protect its assets, it would have focused on the battleships, not the carriers.
Makes sense.
And what about the fact that neither Kimmel nor Short faced court-martial after the attack?
That's a good question.
Some people see that as evidence of a cover-up.
Yeah, maybe they didn't want to reveal sensitive information about code breaking.
Or maybe they were trying to hide the fact that they knew about the attack all along.
It's possible.
Kimmel himself believed there was a cover-up.
He did.
Yeah, he felt like he was being made a scapegoat.
And his intelligence officer commander, Edwin Layton, agreed.
But it's also possible that they just didn't want to court-martial them during the war.
Yeah, it would have been bad for morale.
And they might have been worried about revealing sensitive intelligence capabilities to the enemy.
That's a valid point.
Finally, there's the issue of unreleased classified information and alleged forgeries.
Yeah, there's still a lot of mystery surrounding those.
The material you sent mentions that some Pearl Harbor documents are still classified.
And some might be lost or incomplete.
And there are all sorts of stories about FOIA requests being denied or delayed.
It's like trying to navigate a maze.
There's even a specific document sheet, 94644, that's supposed to contain important information about Japanese Navy movements,
Yeah.
but it's never been fully declassified.
It's like a tantalizing clue.
It makes you wonder what they're still hiding.
It does.
But we also have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Right.
Because some alleged pieces of evidence have turned out to be fake.
Like that supposed transcript of a conversation between Roosevelt and Churchill.
Yeah, that was a forgery.
And there's no National Archives roll T-175 either.
So while there might be some genuine secrets out there,
Mm-hmm.
we also have to be wary of misinformation and disinformation.
Absolutely.
It's a minefield out there.
It is.
So as you can see, the question of whether the U.S. government had advanced knowledge of Pearl Harbor is incredibly complex.
It is.
There are a lot of intriguing statements and intelligence failures.
And a lot of unanswered questions.
The official investigations point to a lack of preparedness and misjudgment.
But the idea that it was a deliberate sacrifice for a greater good continues to fuel debate. It's a compelling narrative.
It is.
And it's easy to see why people are drawn to it.
But it's important to remember that there's a difference between speculation and evidence.
And in this case, the evidence is far from conclusive.
What really stands out to me is how much of this controversy comes down to the human element of intelligence.
Yeah.
The noise, the misinterpretations, the biases.
And the limitations of what they knew at the time.
They were working with incomplete information.
And under immense pressure.
It's easy to judge them in hindsight.
It is.
But we have to remember that they were doing the best they could with what they had.
That's right.
So this deep dive has really made me think about how much our understanding of the past depends on the information that's available to us, and how that information can be shaped by secrecy agendas and even forgeries.
It's a reminder that history is not always what it seems.
Exactly, and that we should always be questioning and seeking out new perspectives.
Absolutely.
So what do you think?
I think this is just the beginning of our exploration into this pivotal moment in history.
And I think it's a journey worth taking,
Yeah.
because the more we learn about the past, the better we can understand the present.
And maybe even shape the future.
So let's keep digging
That's it.
and see what other secrets we can uncover.
Sounds good to me.